Hello and good morning, Gar Borras. As you know, it's Sunday morning, and that is a reason for everybody to get happy. And of course, that's everybody's cue, Gar, to know that we're going to be talking about the history of the Partridge Family. How big of a fan were you of that show?
Well, at that time, I was middle school age.
Okay.
And I dressed exactly like the way that they dressed on that show.
Yeah. Oh, man. I got to tell you, I have a different experience, of course, like many people. I'm well aware of the Partridge Family, of course. It's now a retro thing. Very much a pop culture thing. Now, I was a little younger because I got to let people know that I was not born until 1971, and the Partridge Family premiered in 1970. So about a year into the show, I would have been only like a year old. But I did, like many people who are aware of the Partridge Family, I caught it like when it started playing as reruns, on a lot of these retro. So that's kind of how I first got kind of introduced to the Partridge Family, but I'm just as big of a fan as anybody.
Well, at that time, everybody my age was dressing like that.
Yeah.
Basically exactly the way that the kids were dressing in that show. It was really a mirror of what the kids were dressing like at that time. And a lot of people, now when you look back, it's a snapshot of, a part of fashion, during that time, even though, they weren't dressing, in fashion clothing or anything like that, but it shows you what real America was dressing like at that time. Not fashion America, real people at that time.
I get what you're saying, because, it's funny when I posted that we were going to be talking about the Partridge Family when we recorded today's episode on our Facebook page. I got thinking immediately when I posted the photo of the Partridge Family cast. I thought, right, just looking at that, you can tell that that's got to be a photo from around either the 1960s or 1970s, just based on the picture alone, the clothes and the different colors. And it's kind of like you always heard that old saying that a photo is truly a snapshot in time. And the older we get, and even doing these episodes, I realize that, because kind of like what you're saying, I think part of the reason you were so such a big fan of the Partridge Family, we haven't even gotten to the music and the show itself, but the fashion alone, you unlike oftentimes when you watch a movie or a TV show, you might feel like you're an outcast because the people on the TV show, they look so fancy, they look so different than me. But you felt like, hey, I could be one of those kids in that show,
Well, yeah, and that had a huge part as to why, everybody that was my age was just attracted to the show like a magnet.
Sure.
Because, it really, it was almost like watching a mirror of your life, that you're watching it on TV, and it really endeared itself to that generation at that time. Unlike other shows that try to influence those things, or this show was just basically mirroring what America, looked like, and also the storylines of the show were kind of delving into what was happening in young people's lives at that time too.
Yeah.
Kind of what situation comedies evolved into later on, because having storylines that mirrored what was going on with young people's lives became a staple of situation comedy. But at the time of the Partridge Family, this was an experiment at that time. It was being toyed with at that time to see how the public would react, and it really worked.
And let me ask you, Gar. So you're middle age at the time when the Partridge Family is originally on TV. At that time, when you're in middle school, did you have any inklings that you had any desire, like when you grew up, you're wanting to become a musician? The fact that you watched the Partridge Family and a lot of it's based around the music. Did you think that played a role at all in you wanting to one day become a musician?
Well, yes, because that is exactly the time, that whole interest was, it was sparking at that time, and it wasn't because of the show.
No.
For me, it was my some of my family that my uncle was stationed in Ecuador, and then he was getting stationed out here in California. And when my uncle were looking for a house, my cousins stayed with my sister and I. And it was my cousin Frank that he really didn't know much, but he taught me what little he knew about playing guitar.
Wow!
And I just squeezed as much as I could get out of him, which wasn't really very much.
Yeah.
But it was enough to get a foothold.
Yeah.
It was enough to take that and use that to teach myself how to play. Without those starting blocks, I really had nothing to grab hold of. But this is also at the exact same time that the Partridge Family is on. So it's all intertwined for me.
Yeah, of course, we're talking about this 40 years after a fact, Gar, but let me ask you, now that you've gone on and have had a career as a musician, going back to when you were first watching these episodes of the Partridge Family, would you say they made it look real easy, like to be what life in a band was like, what it was like to create music, or would you say it was kind of really different?
No, it's always been the job of the musicians or the performers to make it look easy.
Yeah.
That's always been the job of the entertainer.
Yeah.
And it was no different at that time. But see, that's the thing. The general audience watches these people performing, and of course it's their job to make it look easy. So when you're watching from the audience, you think, oh my gosh, that it's so easy, I want to do that too.
Yeah.
And then they dive in, and then they realize, holy crap, there is a lot of, I'm at the bottom of a mountain, and I got to start climbing up this mountain.
Yeah.
Forget it. You know what I mean? And that's what happens with a lot of people. They see it. Oh, it looks so easy, and then they try it, and then they figure it out. Oh my gosh, this is way harder than ever anticipated, and then they wind up just quitting.
Yeah.
But the truth of the matter is yes, it's very, very difficult to learn to become an entertainer, but it's not any different than the difficulties of becoming a successful executive.
Yeah.
Or successful in other lines of business and where you make your living. So the truth of the matter is people have this initial thing, it's so easy, and then when they find out it's not easy, then they just quit. They throw their hands in the air. But but it takes a special type of person that doesn't throw their hands in the air and grabs the bull by the horns and starts wrestling with that bull.
Oh, sure. Gar, I think the point you just made is very good. I mean, basically what you're saying is that's entertainment. They did their job. They entertained us. And to kind of further make that point, we're going to get into this a little more deeper later in the episode, but very much like the Monkees before the Partridge Family. People initially were sitting down watching the Monkees and the Partridge Family thinking, oh, okay, Danny Bonaducci's playing the bass, so, he's got a bass in his hand. He must be really playing the bass. Come to find out, again, back in the 1970s, these were kind of trade secrets that were kind of really kept under wraps, that we're much more aware of how TV shows and movies are made. And kind of what I'm talking about is the only one in the Partridge Family, from what I learned through the research for today's episode, that could actually sing were David Cassidy and Shirley Jones. And that had a huge reason to do with why they were cast. But if you listen to any of the songs or the albums that were put out in conjunction with the Partridge Family, they were all session musicians that were creating the sounds we were hearing. But because that was a band on the TV show, because those other people held instruments in their hands, we were fooled into thinking that they were actually creating the music that we were hearing.
Well, the truth of the matter is it was kind of a secret, but it wasn't a well-protected secret.
Yeah.
Because I was around during that time, and I wasn't fooled. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I was watching the show, and you know what I mean? I never felt like I was led to believe.
Not led to believe, but I guess a better way of putting it is very much, I think you and I talked about this also when we did our episode on Back to the Future. I know initially, as a teenager, seeing that movie, the part where Michael Jackson's strutting across the stage playing the guitar, doing Johnny Be Good, I'm thinking, oh man, this guy could sing. He's playing the guitar. Again, what I mean by we were led to believe it is we kind of know that it wasn't really him singing now. He was just kind of playing the part, but they were entertaining us. I was convinced I was believing what I was seeing, if you know what I mean.
I think that when the Monkees was doing it, I think it was much more of a
kept secret.
A much stronger attempt at trying to keep that a secret.
Yeah.
But by the time Partridge Family hit, it was just kind of a loosely protected secret. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It wasn't like treated the same way as it was during the time that the Monkees. And this was also during a time where it was a big explosion of all of that stuff. At this same time, there was a explosion of popularity of the dance shows.
Sure.
And there was just a whole bunch of them that were on TV. There was one called Hullabaloo, where the house band was Paul Revere and the Raiders.
Oh, wow.
And there was a bunch of others, too. And I remember at that same time, I would be watching those dance shows. And at the same time, American Bandstand was the one that survived, I mean, the rest of them kind of, waned and everything. But at the same time as American Bandstand was in full, swing, there was a bunch of other ones, too, that were really super popular at that time, too. So you've got TV shows like the Monkees and the Partridge Family, and then you've got all these dance shows. And, this whole 60s, flower power thing was in full swing, in the late 60s and early 70s. It was a real unique time.
Yeah. And now, as far as when that time was, like we said, in the early 70s, but the Partridge Family premiered on ABC on September 25th, Gar, 1970. It ran for 4 seasons for a total of 96 episodes. The final episode aired on March 23rd, 1974. And again, you're making a point that this is it was interesting. It was really a sitcom, but it was based around this family that I'm going to get a little more in detail. It's really based on a specific family. We're going to get into that, but it is based around music. The fashion was very very important part of the show. I mean, it had less to do with the hippie days. It was just that's what people wore, like you said at the time, and that was a very important part of the show. Now it said the Partridge Family was created by Bernard Slade, who is a Canadian playwright and screenwriter, and as a screenwriter, Gar, he also created before the Partridge Family the TV sitcom The Flying Nun.
Flying Nun was happening, and it was, you would look at the premise for that show and scratch your head nowadays.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? What in the world were they thinking? But at the time when that show was out, it was popular. There were a lot of people watching The Flying Nun. It was not a joke at the time.
Yeah, and but my point too being. You'd be surprised to learn that the same guy created both shows because they're so different. But I think as a writer, that shows you his level of talent.
Well, he's got more than he's not a one-hit wonder.
Yeah.
But this is also during the time when everybody, teenagers and people of middle school age. We're all, the classic bedroom at that time, your bedroom had posters all over the walls. And if it was a girl's bedroom, David Cassidy's picture was on the wall. Mark Lindsay, the singer for Paul Revere and the Raiders, was on the wall. Bobby Sherman's picture was on the wall. These were all the popular guys, that the girls had crushes on at that time.
Yeah.
So this is also, this is what's going on at home at the same time that the Partridge Family was airing on TV. All the girls had David Cassidy's pictures plastered all over their walls.
Yeah. And here's what I was getting at. Now, Gar, I didn't know if you are aware of this, but the Partridge Family was loosely based on the Coswells, a family pop group that was famous in the 1960s. And the Coswells were originally considered to play the role of the Partridge Family, but they were not trained actors, and it was decided that the Coswell children were too old to play the parts of the kids.
Well, the Cowsills.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah,
and I was around at that time. I keep saying that, but
you were.
The Cowsills were kind of a B-level pop band at that time. They at the same time that you would have these teen magazines that the girls would just race to the stores to go buy because they would have all kinds of stuff about their guys that they had crushes on and stuff like that, and it was just it was a time when everybody was it was all capitalizing on crushes.
Yeah. Now,
Does that
Gar,
make sense? Capitalizing on crushes.
Let me ask you, having been around at that time and being aware of who the Cowsills were, would you say they remind you anything of the Partridge Family? Could you say, oh yeah, I could see that?
Yes, okay. Because if you could, look back, I don't know if you could Google it.
I probably could.
I don't know if they're so faded in the past.
Yeah.
That you really, but they really, if you could see their, how they were being marketed at that time, it's really a mirror of the Partridge Family. It really was a mirror of the Partridge Family, and totally, for people of my generation that were into all of this at that time, it was totally embraced.
Wow.
By us at that time, and it totally makes sense. When you look back and they say that the show is based on the Cowsills, because I'm getting repetitive, it really is a mirror of the Partridge Family. They are a mirror of each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's important to know, though, Gar, because, I mean, it's not exactly the same thing, but I remember, the movie Rockstar that had Jennifer Aniston in it and Mark Wahlberg, and it was supposed to be based kind of on the life of Rob Halford, where you see the movie and there's no real
It's actually a story about Ripper Olin
joining the band, I guess, replacing it. And really the only similarity to the story was the fact that the singer was being replaced in the movie band was gay. That was kind of the only thing that was really had any truth to it. So I think it's important to have kind of authenticity when you're saying, okay, this is what the show is based on. It's good to know that they did a good job of portraying what the actual family was like.
Yeah, when it's so, here I am doing my Jimmy Stewart.
You're getting into it, but that means you're really excited.
During that time period, when people look back nowadays, people that are unfamiliar with that time period will look at the Partridge Family and immediately go hippie.
Yeah, and it wasn't.
You know what I mean?
It wasn't.
The truth of the matter is, they are post-hippie.
Yeah, exactly. It's about 10 years after the hippie generation.
I mean, just right after, not a long time after, but it is post-hippie, but it's like right after hippie.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a transitional period where it's transitioning from hippie to what became the fashion of the 70s.
Yeah, and I'm not really sure what Shirley Jones was doing before. I know she was an actress and a singer, but like many things in life, it was the Partridge Family that actually made her a little more famous and kind of put her on the map after the show was on the air, because the thing is, she became more well known, and interestingly enough, after the show went off the air for the rest of her life, anytime anybody would mention Shirley Jones, they would immediately think of the Partridge Family.
Yeah, and she was married to David Cassidy's
father,
Jack Cassidy.
Yeah.
And when I was doing some research, I found out that he originally was considered as part of the cast for the Partridge Family, but the producers decided to go without him. And Shirley Jones in interviews later on basically was alluding to the Partridge Family led to the demise of her marriage to Jack Cassidy. So unfortunately, there was some animosity between from Jack Cassidy at being cast aside. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And becoming an afterthought, because in reality, Jack Cassidy really hadn't, his career was on the decline.
Sure.
And up to that point, Jack Cassidy was a big star, but it really, the Partridge Family is kind of that pivotal point where Jack Cassidy's career started going on the decline, and then her marriage to him declined too.
Yeah, and so people got to remember too, Gar, at that time, 1970, when the Partridge Family premiered, Partridge Family even predates Mary Tyler Moore, and so it's just a few years later when all that, woman and girl power stuff started. And so for a man back, around that time to feel like, his wife is being chosen over him, but that had to be a real big thing,
Well, some people don't have become, because this is part of the business, and people come to understand it. But at that time, it wasn't part of the business, and it was all being learned at that time.
Sure.
So I'm sure people like David Cassidy were reacted to it differently.
Yeah.
Where people nowadays are more familiar with these kind of things happening, so they react to it with a higher emotional intelligence nowadays.
Sure.
And then some people don't.
Sure. And
even today, some people do not react to those kind of things with a higher emotional intelligence. But back in those days, you really can't blame Jack, because this was not the norm.
Yeah.
This was all part of just being discovered, and it was a rude awakening for him.
Yeah, and I was reading that the producers were so set on having Shirley Jones play the part of the mother. They didn't even consider any of the actresses. They wanted her so bad that it was important for them to get her to sign a contract, and that way they felt, okay, once we get her to sign the contract, we've got her,
Well, I could totally see the producers seeing her as the centerpiece, because at the time when they're launching the show, she had the biggest star power
of anybody.
of all the people that were on the show. Now, eventually, David Cassidy, with the song, I Think I Love You and all of that stuff, his popularity just went through the roof. But it's because of the show. But when they were launching the show, she was the biggest star of all of them. She brought more star power than any of the other cast members.
You are so right about that, Gar, because I was like watching just the opening of an episode of the Partridge Family in preparation for this today, and initially the starring power, the way they cast people was very important back in the day. And initially, it said starring Shirley Jones and co-starring David Cassidy, where he was almost billed as a second lead for the show, but he surpassed everybody.
That's one of those indicators of what I'm talking about, because at the time of launching, this is how they were billing it. Then later on, they weren't billing it that way anymore. It was basically the David Cassidy show. That's eventually what it evolved into.
Yeah.
And you also have to look at Susan Day. She was the classic quintessential 70s girl.
Yeah.
Because when you look at the way she dressed and her hair and everything about what she was, what the producers were doing with her mirrored what all the other girls were using as their influence for fashion. She had a huge part of that. And it's so kind of weird, because it was only with the girls that were within that age. And because of it, a lot of people don't really know how big of an influence she was, because it's kind of shrouded and faded now. But at that time, she was one of the number one influences for female fashion for middle school and high school girls at that time.
And Gar, you make a great point, because she's not an obvious pinup model, a lot like Farrah Fawcett or anything, but how many teenage boys like yourself at the time, every time you tune in for an episode, were checking her out, if you know what I mean?
Oh, I thought she was absolutely stunningly beautiful.
Yeah, and
stunningly beautiful. And now you look back, and it's so, hindsight is always 20/20.
Yeah, exactly.
And you look back, back and you start seeing these things. But at that time, when I was alive, I wasn't thinking about these things, about how she was influencing fashion and all of these other things. Those were the last things. Now, the show did, the way the kids were dressing did influence me in how I was dressing at that time, because I have a middle school picture of me, and I look exactly like I stepped right out of an episode of the Partridge Family.
And at the same time, Gar, I mean, the Partridge Family was displayed as, which it should be, as a wholesome family. So, as hot as a teenage guy might have thought Susan Day was, you never tune in and catch her wearing like a halter top, because stuff like that was just not allowed on TV back in the day. And they had a whole thing about, and again, I understand this, it's a family show. You want to portray the family in a certain way, and I think they did a great job of that.
Well, it's funny you mentioned halter top.
Yeah.
Because at that time period, halter tops were really popular with the girls.
Sure.
And they were really popular with the boys, even though they weren't really saying anything.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because the halter tops were awesome
sure.
at that time. And I really, it might sound male chauvinist, and I don't mean it disrespectfully.
Hey, you're just being a guy, Gar.
But I wish they would bring that back.
Yeah, hey, Gar, you're just being a guy. It's in your DNA. Nothing to be ashamed of. And you make a great point. You're talking about, in the 1970s, another big thing at the time, you had these teen idols. I mean, all the kids on this cast are probably considered teen idols. You had people like Leif Garrett at the time, and I remember in the 70s being around a big thing. Tell me you don't remember 16 magazine and teenage magazines and stuff like that.
That's where you would find all those pictures of
these guys.
David Cassidy, and like you said, Leif Garrett was like, all of those magazines were so popular at that time. I'm sure, like all the teenage girls were rushing to the store to buy the newest, edition of those magazines at the time. And it's a completely lost thing nowadays. You go and you see the magazine rack at whatever place.
It's not what it used to be.
You're not going to find a 16 magazine anymore.
It's not what it used to be, yeah.
And it's just such a thing of the past and everything. So, and at that time, of course, the last thing that's going through anybody's mind is, that all of this stuff was going to have an expiration date.
Yeah, Gar, and why I love doing these episodes, as we've discussed many times before, so often during the episode, stuff like this comes up that I was not even initially aware we were even going to be talking about. It just comes up in the conversation. But, talking about these teen magazines and teen idols back in the day, was once a big thing. You had shows like the Partridge Family, and then as a result, stuff like these teen magazines began to exist. These are things that they never initially even thought of. And then I'm sure when David Cassidy signed on to do the Partridge Family, he had no idea that all these girls were going to have his poster hung up on their bedroom wall. These girls were going to be having fantasies about it. But it became almost a second kind of part of the industry as a result of somebody's popularity.
I've got something unique to bring up.
Sure.
Okay. Now, this is at the same time that Playboy was going on. And what was really popular with Playboy, that what they started was the centerfold.
Yes.
Okay? Now, teen magazines
started
inadvertently stole that idea that Playboy was doing with the centerfold, and when they would come out with their newest episode, they would have their centerfolds too.
Yeah.
And I'm going to bring up a point. Everybody in my generation already knows this, but people from other generations, it's never crossed their mind. Where do you think that all those pictures that are on teenagers' walls came from?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because when I was describing earlier that everybody at that age, when you went in their room, they had all those pictures on their wall. Yeah. Where do you think those centerfolds came from? They came from those teen magazines, like 16 magazine, and all of those. Those were centerfolds from teen magazines.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about stuff like Teen Magazine was a lot of times you get magazines that are centralized around one thing. Like, for example, you might have a magazine that's centralized around, metal music or even rap music. But what I used to love about those teen magazines, it was kind of whatever was popular at the time. You could pull out a teen magazine, and in the same episode, you might have Peter Frampton, Kiss, and David Cassidy all on the same cover,
Well, that would be during a transitional period.
Yeah, but
I mean, where it's transitioning from the 60s to the 70s. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
The hippies to the, what the 70s became.
Yeah.
But it's so trippy to think that something that Playboy started actually started a trend that other magazines decided, let's capitalize on this, because those centerfolds had a lot to do with the reason why girls were rushing to the store to buy those 16 magazines so they could get the poster of their favorite. Oh my gosh, they got a crush on whoever, and they're going to put that poster on their wall. That's where they got all these posters from.
And Gar, to take it to a further giant leap in regards to what a huge influence like a magazine like Playboy magazines had just on pop culture in general. I mean, eventually Playboy would also get into things like, once they get past the centerfold, like, okay, you know what? Instead of just having these great-looking women as centerfolds, we'll have some magazine covers where we have some celebrity women, and they can show the goods. But even Playboy got to be so popular at one point. Not only did they have celebrities on the cover, but they also got to a point where somebody got the bright idea. Okay, if we have a magazine like Playboy for men, we need to come up with the equivalent for women, like where we have magazine good-looking guys,
Yeah, that one didn't go so well.
Yeah, interestingly enough.
They really tried.
Yeah.
And it kind of got off to a decent start, but it lost steam.
Yeah, and you can see why. Now, here's some fun trivia for you, Gar. Did you know that they filmed 2 different pilots that were filmed for the Partridge Family? One aired and one didn't.
Well, the one that didn't air was the one that had Jack Cassidy in it.
Yeah, and it said in the version that was never aired, Shirley Jones went by the name of Connie. That was her character, and her boyfriend was, like you said, played by her real-life husband, Jack Cassidy, the father of David Cassidy. So, interesting trivia there.
Uh-huh.
And it said that the Partridge Family was very popular TV show, and at the time, because of the show growing popularity and the toll that fame took on the show's cast, began to really affect many of the members of the Partridge Family. David Cassidy, mainly because he became the huge star of the show, like you were saying, and it got to a point that not only did he feel like he was being typecast, but he also felt that just the fact that every fan was wanting to know his every move and stuff. He got to a point like around 1972, 2 years into the show, where he did this cover for People, not People magazine. What was it? Rolling Stone magazine.
Oh, Rolling Stone, yes.
Where he was kind of nude on the cover, and it was very controversial at the time. Where I guess it didn't show his complete nude body, but the upper half, very controversial at the time, and he was trying to shed his clean image, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, then again, this is early in when all of these type of shows, were, people are discovering, in your career you want to become, famous, and then when you become famous, then you realize, oh man, this is way more than I anticipated, and then now you want out. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Or now you want to change that trajectory. You know what I mean? So. I think he was having a normal reaction at that time, but nobody's got a crystal ball, and he didn't know that was going to really be the pinnacle of his success. Yeah. Because after that, he really, it just kind of,
it kind of went on a downward spiral.
It became something more of a trivia thing.
Yeah, I mean, it went on a real downward spiral. The interesting thing, it wasn't immediate. It took like years because, of course, as we all know, he died a few years ago. It said on November 21st, 2007, after years of suffering from both drug and alcohol abuse, it finally got the better of him. It got to a point where he stopped performing because at first he was saying that it was his alcohol addiction. I remember he actually went on Dr. Phil and was talking about, but Dr. Phil revealed years after he died, that Cassidy had died, that he says he was suffering also from dementia at his age. He said because he was going to do shows and he couldn't remember the lyrics to his own songs.
Yeah, that's unfortunately, it's one of those stories of, keep going until the wheels fall off.
And apparently David Cassidy, I didn't realize this.
And that's basically the way that went. He went all the way until the wheels fell off.
And apparently I didn't realize this, but he was 67 when he died. I didn't realize he was that old. I mean, wasn't that old, but he was older than what I thought he was, so it's interesting. Of course, Shirley Jones died a few years before him, and many of the cast, well, I shouldn't say many, but like Danny Bonaducci, he suffered for years too with drug addiction and alcohol addiction. He was homeless for a couple of years. But everybody loves a comeback story, and he's had a comeback story. He's had his up and down over years. He had this reality show where he kind of came back, and he became very popular on the radio. So people were kind of happy to see him kind of finally get his life together.
Yeah, I hope he keeps it, together because, he was kind of like, he wasn't as popular as David Cassidy.
Yeah.
But he had his own popularity during his time on the show because he was more of the comedic relief.
Sure.
Of the cast. He was the funniest of the characters.
Yeah, I heard him talk over years, like when he'd go on talk shows, he said him and Cassidy especially were very close in real life, and he said, I always looked up to him kind of like he really was my big older brother. He said, but on the show I kind of also felt like I was playing second fiddle to him. But again, I think many people, I know myself, I include this when I think of the part, Danny Bonaducci is one of the people I remember from that show because, he was not quite the youngest member of the show, but like you said, he got a lot of the funny lines, and so I remember a lot of the stuff that he was doing on the show.
Yeah, he really had a comic ability, and they capitalized on that with the show because there was a lot of times that he did some really cool, funny stuff that was on the show, but the core of the cast was Shirley Jones, Danny Bonaducci, Susan Day, and David Cassidy. That was the core of the show. You could interchange anyone else,
in fact,
in that cast,
in fact,
and it really wouldn't affect the show. But, those four really were the core of the cast of that show.
It's funny you say that, Gar, because that's actually what happened. The one that played the youngest son, I don't know his name, but he was replaced by another boy. And I don't know why, but like you make a very good point. I don't know that the other two kids had to really be there, except maybe just take up positions in the band. But for whatever reason, people don't remember them as much as the other cast members. I don't know if it's because they were so young or just the other people were more talented. I don't know, but that's kind of interesting, you know.
Well, and the guy that played the manager, I mean, you know, he was a fairly well-known actor at the time.
Now, Gar.
You know, I mean, he could even be interchanged.
Hey, Gar, do you know what he did after the Partridge Family?
No. What?
Do you remember the show Alice? He played Mel Sharple's best friend Earl. He was a basketball coach. He was in Alice. He was like one of the extras they had regularly.
Well, he had a very successful career. Maybe he was never a main
leading
character
actor
in anything, but he was always able to stay very busy, you know, doing supporting characters.
Sure, and Gar, how could we not talk about the Partridge Family and bring up the tour bus, the old kind of broken down school bus? But you know, it was different, but it was always a topic of the show, you know.
Well, you know, and the truth is if you would you know, think of it, you know, the tour bus is the symbol for the show.
Yeah.
And you know, it is there. You know, at that time, you know, there were tour buses that looked exactly like that, or exact same versions. You know, with the flower power on the bus and everything like that. That was going on at that time.
Yeah.
So, you know, so there was a little bit of a familiarity to having that tour bus, but it really was the symbol for the show.
It really was, because that's the one thing I know we think of. I can include myself when I remember back on the Partridge Family, that crazy looking tour bus. But it was cool. It was a main feature in the show, and you could see why. And you know, we were talking at the beginning of today's episode, Gar, about the fact when the show first aired. Initially, producers only knew that Shirley Jones was the only one in the cast that could talk, but eventually David Cassidy went to the producers and said, he let them know, hey, I can sing too, but before they would let him, you know, even sing in an episode, he had to kind of prove, you know, he kind of auditioned for him, and they were convinced. They said, okay, so now just you and Shirley are the ones that are going to be singing in the show. But initially, David Cassidy, like we said, who'd go on to become the huge star of the show, he had to kind of prove himself to the executives.
Yeah, had he not done that, he would have never gotten the chance.
He might have had a very different career. And another thing, Gar, that many shows from that time were known for, the Partridge Family became known for their huge cast of guest stars. And many of these people that appeared as guest stars, one comes from like Johnny Cash. And I was reading, Shirley Jones was saying she was very impressed with Farrah Fawcett, because when she made a guest appearance in or did her role for the Partridge Family in an episode, she wasn't really anybody famous at the time. She was just kind of starting her career, appearing in a TV show. And Shirley Jones told people years later, I knew she was going to go on to do something with herself.
Well, and she sure did, boy. You know, but there, you know, Jodie Foster,
Dick Clark, Richard Pryor. I was reading. You know,
it's
quite a list.
A literal who's list. You know, because you know, it was really popular at that time when a TV show became popular.
Yeah.
Then it became something that other actors would be very attracted to doing a guest cameo on those shows. That was a really popular thing at that time. And so that gives you one of those outside indications of how popular the Partridge Family was, because of that list of impressive who's who.
They would go on to have huge careers, yeah.
People that wanted to be on that show as a guest cameo.
Yeah, and let's talk a little more about Danny Bonaducci. Interesting enough, Gar, I was learning that in doing the research for this today, Danny Bonaducci often had trouble reading his lines at script readings, and years later he found out it was because he suffered from dyslexia, very much like our other idol, the Fonz, Henry Winkler. He suffered with dyslexia, but he didn't find out for years.
It's so weird because you could wind up suffering from something and you don't even know it.
Because at the time, like many things, there's things going. There's diseases and illnesses people don't even know what it is. It takes years for more people to suffer from it. In spite of having dyslexia, now this is kind of showing you how he could be the annoying kid. In spite of having dyslexia, Danny also had a great memory, and this is how he was able to learn his lines. Once he would learn the lines, he was able to kind of memorize his lines, but he also was able to learn the lines of his cast members. And at rehearsals, he would, as they're supposed to be saying their lines, he would kind of say the lines of his cast members out loud, and many of the cast members would get annoyed with that.
You have to understand, you got a kid at that age, and those are the kind of things that
the kids do.
Kid that age is gonna do.
Yeah.
So he was just a normal kid
doing what kids do.
What kids do at that stage of their life. He did have a little bit of a rambunctious side to him and stuff like that, but it was all in fun.
Yeah, of course.
It was not in evil or anything like that. He wasn't like the devil child.
No.
He was more of an instigator, a fun-loving, prankster on the set.
Yeah, and I don't know how to put this, but years later, Danny Bonaducci becomes an interesting case study because years later, as we sit here and do this, Gar, we can sit here and talk about the troubled life of child stars like Gary Coleman, Dana Plato, Danny Bonaducci. He suffered a lot, but he's one of the lucky ones in the sense that he made it through. He's still here, so so there's that.
Well, during that time period, child stars. The number, the percentage of child stars that would go bad with their lives, it was a very high percentage of child stars during that time period that they would have success as a child star, and then that success would basically it would have a very detrimental effect on their lives. It was a very, very high percentage. Nowadays, you still have child stars that it has a very detrimental, but that percentage is much, much lower because we've learned over the years about the effects of fame on children and all of these things, and so there are attempts by the studios and families to surround these kids with much more normalcy nowadays.
Yeah, and
at that time, it was all kind of being discovered, and these kids were kind of innocent victims.
That's a great way.
Nobody knew what these detrimental effects were going to be, and everybody just went into it, not really knowing, that there was going to be a dark side.
That's a great way of putting it, Gar, because, it was kind of being discovered around this time. It was I don't even want to say it was a well-kept secret. I don't think people had the awareness, the knowledge that they do all these years later of what some of these child stars went through. And as a result of your Gary Coleman, as a Danny Bonaducci's and Dana Plato's, as a child actors now, I don't want to say they don't have it as tough, but there are certain rules that have been put in place, like, kids still must attend school regularly. They can only work between certain hours. They once it becomes a certain time at night, they can no longer be on the set. So certain things are put in place so kids today don't have to suffer the way the child stars were when we were growing up.
Yeah, and none of that stuff was going on back then.
Yeah.
None of it. These kids were left to their own devices.
And you
take that kind of money and that kind of fame, and you combine it with a child that's still in their developing years.
And then
you know, see what I mean?
Yeah, and then you even look at a guy like Danny Bonaducci that eventually gets into being addicted to drugs and stuff. When you're a young, famous child star, especially in your teenage years, and you've had this kind of fame and success, you have people bringing the drugs to you. You have people telling you you can have anything you want.
Yeah, there's a million people coming out of the woodwork being yes people to you and shoving that mirror in your face because they want to be your friend.
Not even your friend. They want to just hang on to you so they can have a part of that life.
Yeah, they want to be able to stay in your orbit, and the only way they know how is by shoving a mirror in your face.
Yeah, and just before we kind of wrap it up for today, Gar, just to kind of give people an idea of the popularity of the Partridge Family, I think this is going to really make that point, because who was bigger back then as far as music than the Beatles? Now it said, get this, Gar, you're going to love this. I Think I Love You knocked the Beatles song Let It Be out of the #1 spot on the Billboard Top 100 chart in 1970. That's a pretty big feat for a song from a TV show to be able to do.
Well, anytime you knock the Beatles out of #1, you've achieved a major feat.
Because not everybody can say that, right?
No, and that's the thing about the whole popularity of the Beatles is becoming so faded that there is a large swath of people out there that are completely unaware of the radical achievements that the Beatles were able to make, to the point where, if you have like one song by David Cassidy that knocks them out of the #1 spot, that's a major feat.
And can you imagine if you're David Cassidy at the time? I mean, the ego you must have. I mean, because that is a big accomplishment, and even that's part of his legacy to say, hey, that's the guy that knocked the Beatles out the #1 spot with Let It Be. I mean, that's quite a thing to have for bragging rights,
Yeah, but then again, at that same time, you're thinking, well, the next thing I'm going to do is going to be just as big.
Yeah.
And the next thing,
and that's kind of what happened.
Wind up materializing,
and that's kind of what.
So it's a time of great elation, but quickly followed by a slap of reality.
And that's kind of what happened here, especially in David Cassidy's case, because once that happened, they, in addition to just starring on the Partridge Family, all of a sudden they were sending him in the recording studio. They gave him recording. You're going to make your own records. We're going to send you on tour. So, and he had all that fanfare, and it got to a point where he was exhausted. In fact, I was reading when David Cassidy finally announced he was leaving the show due to exhaustion, producers originally, get this, considered bringing in Rick Springfield to replace him. Now, I think before Jesse's Girl or before Rick Springfield made it huge himself in the music industry.
This is way before anybody.
He was
way before he was ever even thought of for General Hospital.
Yeah. But so I don't know, but where they got Rick Springfield from, but that's kind of it. In a way, it's good it didn't happen. I think the show, once he announced he wanted to leave, they just kind of ended the show. I was reading that many companies, including Columbia Pictures, were making a ton of money off of David Cassidy, Gar, and his image. And because he was only 19 years old when he started the show, at the time, this is interesting. This is how different the world was back then in the 19th. When you were under, you weren't considered a legal adult until you were 21 back then. So because he signed the contract when he was only 19, he was considered a minor. And that's how these people were able to kind of make money off
it. He was able to renegotiate his contract and get the money he actually deserved.
Yeah, he finally did that once he turned 21, and he told them, okay, you want me to re-sign the contract? You want me to stay on the show? We're going to renegotiate this. And, of course, they wanted him to stay on, so he got what he wanted.
Well, and that was a real smart move on his part. You know, I mean, whoever discovered, you know, this, you know, the null and void thing that happened in the original contract.
And the people,
you know what I mean?
The people behind the scenes are always smarter.
But, you know, at the same time, this show was going on. They were making all kinds of money off of his likeness.
Sure.
And he was not being compensated for any of this because this is all before, people, you know, started putting it in their contracts about being compensated if their likeness is used to generate profit.
People sue for that now, and they win big time. Yeah.
Yes. So when it was happening to David Cassidy, the studios were making all kinds of money off of all of these other things from his likeness, and he was not receiving a single dime
Initially,
for any of it.
Well, it said initially,
and that was by him renegotiating his contract was his only way, you know, because nobody had even realized that you could put those kind of things in a contract at that time.
Yeah, and here's another interesting fact. It said that originally Cassidy was only receiving $600 a week for appearing in the show, and that sounds like a lot of money for a 19-year-old kid, but...
Well, a lot of money, and think about this.
Yeah.
$600 a week back in 1970, that was a shitload of money.
Yeah, and again, Gar, to just kind of talk about, you know, what was going on in the world at the time, you know, in 1970, April 10th, 1970 to be exact, Paul McCartney announced he was leaving the Beatles. Now, let's think about that for a minute.
Yeah, well,
how heavy is that?
That time.
Yeah.
This, you know, it's really the dark period for the Beatles.
Yeah.
You know, because you know, at that exact same time, there was a storm brewing behind the scenes.
Sure.
And the public wasn't ready to let go.
Yeah, and Gar, we talked.
And that's the truth. A lot of people, you know, now we're looking at it, back from now to then.
Yeah.
But the truth is when that happened, the public was not ready to let go.
Yeah. And we talk a lot about the fashion of the Partridge Family, and also just talk about fashion in general at the time. During the 1970s, Gar, I learned that the fashion that was really hip included bell-bottom pants that were, of course, made famous.
Sporting bell-bottoms like you wouldn't believe.
And of course,
during the 70s, the entire decade of the 70s, that is what I wore. For all the way from 1970 all the way up until 1980.
And can you guess, Gar, who made bell-bottoms famous back then?
I don't know who, but I just remember...
Sonny and Cher, it said.
Sonny, John Ritter, Jack Tripper,
yeah.
You know, the whole time you watched Three's Company, he wore bell-bottoms.
Well, I get this said that Sonny and Cher was who first made it famous.
Totally makes sense. Yes.
Oversized collars were popular during the 1960s, and disco era, of course, was around then. And aviator glasses were popular back then. Just a few more things, Gar, before you wrap it up. I thought this was interesting. Popular toys during the 1970s included G.I. Joe, Star Wars action figures, Barbie. Barbie's still popular. I mean, they just had the movie. It was nominated for an Oscar. Monopoly board game, Battleship, Nerf football, Hungry Hippos, and the Pet Rock. Remember the Pet Rock?
Yes, I do. Now, can I bring up something about G.I. Joe?
Sure.
Because at that time, you know, I was a little boy, and I was watching those commercials on TV.
Yeah.
And when they introduced G.I. Joe, immediately I had to have it.
Okay.
It was that big of a deal. But it was a very controversial toy at that time because all the years previous to that, it was a shunned thing by that fathers would do to their son, that their sons could not play with dolls.
Yeah, I remember. I remember about that.
And it was always kind of this problem that parents would have, because kids are going to be kids, and a kid doesn't realize that if they're playing with their sister and they want to play too, and they got the Ken doll and they're doing this stuff, and then the parents would come into the room and have a freaking fit, and then drag the kid out of the room because their son was playing with dolls.
Hey, Gar, you know how they eventually...
This was a really shunned thing at that time. And now all of a sudden they introduced a doll that was marketed for boys. And at that time, it was super controversial.
Sure.
Because there were parents that were having an absolute fit. No way am I ever going to buy a doll for my son. And that was really going on at that time.
Wow.
But the backlash from the kids wanting that toy so bad that the parents couldn't fight it anymore, and they wound up having to relinquish. And a lot of people don't know anything about that.
Yeah, I forgot about that. But you know how they eventually got around that? They went from calling it a doll to an action figure. Because that sounds, I guess, I don't know, more manly, I guess. I don't know.
Well, that came way later.
Yeah.
Because the truth of the matter is when it was introduced, there was a major backlash.
Yeah.
About that. There was a large faction of parents that were saying, there is no way I am ever going to buy a doll for my son.
Wow, Gar, I can't believe we've been talking over an hour now, so we're really going to get ready to wrap it up. Before we do, to end our Partridge Family episode, I want to tell people, if you want to just see how big the Partridge Family was and still is, you can go to www.amazon.com, search for the Partridge Family merchandise, and you will be amazed at what you will find. I mean, I was amazed. I just did it to see. All kinds of stuff comes up. And Gar, to continue our 1970s theme, next time you and I do this, we're going to talk in 2 weeks about, get this, one of my all-time favorite movies, Saturday Night Fever. Gar, I cannot wait for that.
That is a huge slice of pop culture.
Yeah, in fact, it's so huge that we're going to it's going to take up 2 episodes, because the first episode, part 1, is going to just be on the movie, and then we're going to get into the Bee Gees and the soundtrack and how that was such a huge part of pop culture back in the day. I mean, the soundtrack and the music from the movie had a life of its own.
It sure did.
Well, Gar Borras, I love doing this show. I say this every episode, but it came out even better than I thought. We talked about and went places I never imagined we'd go, but it was all part of a conversation about the Partridge Family and the time.
I love doing this too, brother.
Okay, take care, brother.